In 2019, gigantic protests erupted all over Chile. They called it the estallido social.
Un estallido social. El estallido social.
The explosion of society. The government of Chile was forced to allow the process for a new constitution. But what this constitutional council is creating right now, in the end, might be the exact opposite of what people fought for. My name is Tommy and this is Discovering Latin American Politics. Today we are talking about the struggle surrounding the new constitution of Chile. We're going to figure out what caused the gigantic protests in 2019 and most importantly, what happened to the constitutional process in the last 4 years. To understand all of this, we have to start at the beginning, in the times of Augusto Pinochet. His military dictatorship was in a very difficult situation. They were getting internationally isolated for being a dictatorship responsible for crimes against humanity, and the democracy movement was growing and growing. The best option Pinochet had was a slow transition to democracy. This way, he stayed in power for another decade and never got persecuted for what he did. At this point I should also mention that during the US-backed dictatorship of Pinochet, Chile became the laboratory of neoliberalism. They tried out new policies that the world hasn't seen before, like privatizing water, for example. These laws were made with the consultation of neoliberal economic scholars, the so-called Chicago Boys. As a result, the dictatorship-era policies were very focused on giving businesses as much freedom as possible, and this also reflected into their constitution. In 1980, this constitution, that would also ensure the road to democracy, was approved by a vote. It can't really be considered a democratic vote because political opposition still was heavily repressed and criminalized, but shifting from a dictatorship to a democracy was popular.
Sí, a la constitución de la libertad.
Now, why were people protesting against the constitution in 2019? In short, because it is considered one of the main reasons for the huge social inequalities that Chileans are facing. One example is Article 19, paragraph 24, which justifies the previously mentioned privatization of water. But the main problem isn't really which exact words were written in the constitution, but rather the laws that were made based on this constitution and the political system that Pinochet and his successors constructed and that still exists until this day. In order to get rid of this neoliberal and authoritarian construct of laws and institutions to create something better, they needed to start at the foundation. They needed to change the constitution. When we take a look at the cost of living, it becomes very apparent why so many people have a problem with these economic policies. These are the monthly costs of living for a family of 4 and for an adult living alone. And these are the average monthly salaries of an electrician, of a teacher, and of a paramedic for 45 hours a week. This is minimum wage, and these are the average monthly retirement pensions for men and for women.
In the Metro of Santiago, you pay for every single ride, but the cost varies on when you are entering. This leads to some people taking the train to work hours before they need to be there, because it's a few pesos cheaper early in the morning.
So when ticket prices rose in autumn of 2019, people feared for not having enough food or not being able to pay rent. This was the moment where Chilean society exploded. It started off with young people jumping over the barriers in the metro, but soon there were millions in the streets protesting, roadblocks all over the country, daily clashes, lootings. The president spoke of Chile being in a war, instances of rape and torture by the police, people losing their eyes to rubber bullets and water cannons, and 34 losing their lives. The only way for the government to end the violence and maintain their power was to allow a referendum for a new constitution. Today, it's relatively calm again. This is just a normal street again. The only reminders of what happened are the missing statue of the colonial general Baquedano and the graffitis and murals all around the city that commemorate the uprising and those who died in it.
Generally speaking, things have gotten back to normal, because the new constitution is not being fought for in the streets anymore, but is being drafted behind me in the ex-Congress building.
The Constitutional Council of 2021 got off to a very promising start. It seemed like a successful democratic revolution, people finally getting rid of the system that made them sick. In surveys, 73% said they were hopeful. 51% said they had trust in the Constitutional Council, which is very high for Chilean politics, and 60% said they felt represented by the Constitutional Council. So it was basically popular with everyone except the right wing. But over time, this initial trust and optimism started to shift. Only 43% of the population went to vote for who is going to be in this Constitutional Council, and mostly left-leaning groups mobilized for the election. So the left and the center-left got 71% of the seats. They didn't need any votes from any center or right-wing party in order to pass anything. And this also reflected in their work. A lot of left-wing policies were directly baked into this new constitution, like the right to abortion, the recognition of indigenous nationalities, and many more. Here's a statistic that shows the groups in the council on a political spectrum and for how many of the paragraphs they voted yes. In the council, the most leftist ones got almost exactly what they wanted. And this was not really the result of a broad societal consensus, but more of a debate between the far left and the moderate left. And they could, because they had a supermajority in the council. But when looking at the total numbers of Chilean voters, you'll notice that they didn't really represent a majority. During the time of the council, the feeling of representation dropped to 40%. From almost everyone except the right wing to almost exclusively the left wing feeling represented by them. And the disapproval of the council's work grew as more and more unpopular policies made it into the draft. The center-left also started distancing themselves from the project. But most importantly, fear amongst the population grew. And this fear gave the perfect opportunity for reactionary counter-campaigns who just wanted to stop the process. Fake news were circulated on a large scale, some even being repeated by large newspapers. Fact-checking sites accidentally confirming fake news about the constitution, taking away people's pensions. And conservative Congress members falsely claiming that the constitution would allow abortion up to 9 months of pregnancy. These misinformation campaigns played into the fears of ordinary people, using them to gain political power for themselves and to stop the new constitution no matter what. On the day of the vote on whether to approve or reject the new constitution, things seemed very close. This vote was obligatory, so the participation would be nearly 100%. The supporters of the new constitution were hopeful but not too optimistic. Their draft was not perfect, but better than the old constitution. In the recent polls, the option of rejection was leading, but only by a few percent. Maybe the public opinion polls were inaccurate, because they only asked a few hundred people. As voting stations closed that evening, everyone was awaiting the results.
Del rechazo, rechazo,
teniendo un 61,86%.
Que rechazan la propuesta constitucional que nos intentó imponer la Convención Constitucional. Esa convención que intentó...
The rejection was stronger than expected. 62% voted against this new constitution. So this was the end of the project. All the destruction, the violence, the chaos, for nothing? Well, after such an uprising, it was clear that something needed to change.
The people who are working on the next constitutional draft behind me right now are part of the second constitutional council. They're all representatives of political parties, so there's no independence like the last time.
And I managed to meet some of them directly at a debate in a university a few days before they were elected.
Demos la seguridad a los militares retirados, a los cañones pero no retirados. No hagamos leyes para hacer en este momento. Preocupémonos de los que estaban y ahí hablemos de seguridad para todos. Pero siempre hablemos de ciclo vital y seguridad humana.
This was one of the two candidates of the center-left pact that forms the smaller part of the current government coalition. On the very left is the candidate of the People's Party. Politically, they are not really left-wing or right-wing, they are just populist. In the middle, we have the representative of Secure Chile, the coalition of the established right-wing parties that formed the last government. The pact who is missing here is unity for Chile. Likely because going to a debate in a university with a strong right-wing reputation like this one is not the most effective use of their time right before the election. Because they are the leftist pact that forms the majority of the current government. The party of the president, Gabriel Boric, is in here as well. And last but not least, we have the representative of the Republican Party.
Definitivamente creo que hay una izquierda hoy día a la que hay que salirle al paso con mucha decisión. Yo estoy convencido de eso. Creo que lo que vimos en el estallido dejó muy claro que hay una izquierda que no quiere dialogar.
They are considered to be far-right and form an opposition both against the established right-wing parties and against the current left-wing government. The day of the election of the second Constitutional Council came, and I accompanied a progressive friend of mine to vote. We talked about how the left wing of the country feels about the election, and I learned about an interesting tendency.
Gente ha estado como súper desconectada del proceso y por eso existe como un gran movimiento de gente que quiere como anular. Es ir a votar pero no marcar nada para como mostrar ese descontento.
There are no independents in this election, and this Constitutional Council is mostly there to approve of things that a non-elected group of experts already wrote. The council only has the power to write or elaborate certain parts. But voting is obligatory, so they called for people to scribble something on the ballot so that their vote would not be counted for any political party. The question that remains is, how big is this tendency going to be? Afterwards, I asked my friend if she was optimistic about the future of the constitutional project.
Honestamente a mí me gustaría que sí se cambiara la constitución y que este proceso sí avance. Y yo siento que es muy difícil que sea peor esta constitución que se está escribiendo a la constitución del 80. Encuentro que es muy difícil que sea peor.
But as the first election results came in, she would revoke her optimism. The biggest margin went to the far-right Republicans, the next biggest to the leftist pact that is in the current government, and then the established right-wing plus one seat to the indigenous representative. The populists and the center-left pact had less than 10%, so they didn't get in. In order to get a paragraph into the constitutional draft, you need 30 seats. So if the right-wing pacts agree on something, it's going into the draft. Interestingly enough, the third biggest voter group actually wasn't for the established right-wing, but were the annihilated votes. The majority of these are likely left-wingers who rejected the process as a whole. If only half of them had voted for the left or center-left list, the right and left wing of the country had to compromise while writing this constitution. But now, the right wing has a supermajority. To understand what this might lead to, we're gonna have to take a closer look at the most dominant party here, the Republicans.
Republicano.
Their founder, José Antonio Cast, left the UDI, one of the established conservative parties, after 20 years of membership, in order to build something new, opposing the entire political establishment. Ideologically speaking, they are authoritarian and in succession of the ideas of the dictatorship. A good example for this is the representative that you saw earlier in the video. In a TV interview, he had this to say about the ex-dictator Pinochet.
Hay un dejo de admiración por el hecho de que creo que fue un estadista, ¿no? Definitivamente un hombre que supo conducir el Estado, ¿no?
I had a hard time understanding what the future of the constitutional project actually looks like, and so I invited a friend who studies political science. Basically, it's possible that it's more right-wing because the right-wing politicians who basically run the Constitutional Council are just going to try to put in their own policies into the constitution. Or it's technically possible that they make a more general constitution, and like this second scenario could hypothetically do something against this big problem of polarization in the country.
Yeah, I think that I really don't think that they're gonna make that. I think that to protect their own interests, they're gonna just make a constitution that serves their political faction.
Now, the second constitutional draft is not out yet, but currently it looks like they are doing exactly that. Just putting in the policies that they like banning abortion, for example, and also diminishing the right to strike. But ultimately it might not really matter, because it looks like this draft is also going to be rejected. But the Republicans don't really care. They don't need to construct a broad consensus, build something new, because they wanted that everything stays the same from the beginning. And so to them it doesn't matter if this constitutional draft will be approved or rejected, because in the end, even if it's rejected, they got what they wanted. They stopped the process. So what was the real reason for why the first Constitutional Council failed and the second Constitutional Council was taken over by right-wingers and dictatorship nostalgists? Was it the left being too caught up in infighting and too self-centered? Or do Chileans just prefer neoliberalism and authoritarianism over democracy? Was it the misinformation campaigns? Or the lack of civic education, the polarization of Chilean society and the overall political apathy? It's hard to tell because all of these factors played into it. All of these are valid points, but the question is which one is more important? And all of these are also interconnected. So yeah, in the end, it's just complex. As an overall lesson, I'm going to keep in mind that when democratic projects like this fail, authoritarians are the ones who take over. So when arguing about how things could be better, one also needs to think about how to actually make these improvements, and most importantly, how to make these improvements last. This was Discovering Latin American Politics. If you come this far, you might as well subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.